Let me begin by asking, what have you made as an observer of individuals and politics and diplomats and leaders? What have you made of his wartime leadership over the past 8 months, I guess starting with that critical first weekend after the invasion when he knocked back an offer of safe passage out of Ukraine with that memorable phrase, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." What have you made of Zelensky as a president?
You know, in any situation, you're partly shaped by your impressions which are inherited or which pre-exist. And the only time I've seen him up close was actually at Glasgow on the sidelines of the COP26 when he and Prime Minister Modi had a very interesting discussion about a range of issues, including business cooperation, investments, trade. What could Ukraine do to build up its relationship with India, because it wasn't really as substantive as it could be. That was my first impression. I must also confess I've really not focused that much on the individual leaderships of different countries in that part of the world, even though I'm very familiar with that part of the world, largely because we've never had a crisis, or we've never had the stakes out there to be that intensively engaged. Having said that, I think a lot of what are the perceptions of the world have been shaped by obviously the events which have happened. For us, from an Indian perspective, our particular challenge was that we had 20,000 students in Ukraine. They were caught in the middle of the conflict. Most of them studied in eastern Ukraine, and extricating them required not just diplomacy in the normal sense, but actually having Prime Minister Modi call up Zelensky, call up Putin, engage me talking to Kuleba and to Lavrov and at various other levels. So I think there's a kind of a cumulative picture out here, and certainly our expectation would be that he's somebody we will continue to be engaged with. In fact, Prime Minister Modi spoke to him last week. In what we believe is the need to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue, because we honestly don't think this conflict is helping anybody at all.
As an analyst, how do you think the war in Ukraine is altering the balance of power in the world? A lot of people say that it is exposing authoritarian states as brittle and weaker than we thought they were previously. What would you say?
It's a bit like that French Revolution question which was asked of Zhou Enlai. I really honestly think it's a bit early in the day to reach very strong conclusions. I mean, this is a conflict which has gone in many ways in unanticipated directions. So if your first 6 months were not exactly predictable, I'm not sure I'd be in a hurry to reach a conclusion right now. And that's not a dodge. It's a genuine, I would say, withholding of judgment, because I don't think anybody serious right now can quite predict where this conflict is going.
We've seen dreadful images out of Ukraine over the last 24 hours. Can I invite you to comment on those missile strikes?
Look, we actually, like many other countries, we issued a statement yesterday on that, and we really think that targeting infrastructure and causing civilian deaths is in in any part of the world, anywhere. I mean, obviously, here you're talking specifically about Ukraine. I mean, this is not something that is acceptable. And I think our effort has been to keep pressing for a return to diplomacy and dialogue.
Speaking of diplomacy, in President Zelensky's remarks to the Institute, I asked him, what would you like Australia to do for Ukraine? And he asked that Australia use its influence at the United Nations to convince as many countries as possible to vote later this week for a resolution in the General Assembly condemning Russia's annexation, alleged annexation of 4 Ukrainian territories. Can you tell us how India will vote in that vote?
You know, I was asked this question yesterday at a press conference, so I have to give you the same reply.
You can give us a different one if you want to reveal more information.
Well, I could give you a different one with the same message, which is normally, nobody puts their vote out, the decision to vote out in front. I mean, you take the call when you have to. We continue to be guided by the need, because look, you have to understand something. A large part of the world today is hurting because of this conflict. It's hurting because their daily lives are impacted in a very, very damaging manner. And these countries with whom we identify ourselves, most of these are countries of the global south. They are actually feeling frustrated because they feel that their problems are being neglected. They're not being recognized by the global debates. And that for them, some kind of a speedy remedy to the challenges that they face in terms of energy security, food security, those are really very, very pressing challenges. If as someone who talks to a lot of my peers and engages many of them personally, and I've just come out of a UN General Assembly where I've met close to about 100 foreign ministers. I can tell you the large body of opinion out there is to try to find a way of bringing this conflict to a speedy end and getting back to the negotiating table. And I think it's important that that sentiment should be factored in, and that it's understandable or perhaps to be expected that different countries in different regions would pursue their priorities and their approaches to this conflict. But if it is pursued in a manner in which a big part of the world, if I can use a metaphor, in a way you can look at it as an East-West conflict, but it has a North-South dimension to it. And I think if the South feels increasingly that the North is tone deaf, that that their suffering, their anxieties are not being addressed, I think that's something which will create a new set of problems, and we can sense that very strongly.
Let me change tack and ask you about China, if I may. As you know well, for 2 years, Beijing had Canberra in the diplomatic deep freeze. And since the new Australian government took office in May, lines of communication have been reopening in different ways. It did seem to me that communications were never interrupted to quite the same degree between Beijing and Delhi, even in your most difficult periods when there were bloody clashes between your two militaries. Can you give us, I know you're very diplomatic, but can you, given that Australia is going through a transition period in our relationship with China, what would be your advice to Australia about how you re-establish a stable, productive relationship with a country that is so different from our own?
I am, especially after I became foreign minister, I'm very careful about giving advice. I'm even more careful about giving advice publicly. What I can share with you is that we've had 2.5 very difficult years in our relationship with China, which has included the first bloodshed we've had on the border after 40 years. And where we actually lost 20 soldiers. But my endeavor has been to keep the communication lines going. In fact, the morning after that, I called up my counterpart Wang Yi and urged him to ensure that there are no escalatory moves or complicating moves on the Chinese side. So for me, diplomacy is about communication. It's not just in relationship to China, even in relationship to your earlier set of comments about Ukraine. If diplomats do not communicate with each other, then what kind of diplomacy do they do? So I really feel, shutting down, talking, burning bridges, and I say this as a general principle. I would not, recommend it to anybody. There can be very testing times. I mean, we have another neighbor with whom we have a very difficult relationship. But, at the end of the day, countries have to deal with each other, and you have to find some way of keeping that going.
Let me ask you about India's relationship with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
In the past few years, the US has overtaken China, I think, as India's biggest trading partner. There have been a number of steps that have been taken, even in recent years, with intelligence sharing and so on. What sort of changes have you noticed in the relationship since President Biden was elected? How has it changed in different ways as Biden came in?
Well, the India-US relationship started changing, I would say, from Clinton's second term.
Mm-hmm.
Clinton came to India in 2000, literally the last year of his presidency. He sort of started something moving. Then really George W. Bush, I think, did the big moves thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting, you had 5 American presidents, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. Can't think of 5 people more different from each other,
Mm-hmm.
Who have disagreed amongst themselves on a whole lot of issues at home and abroad, but who've actually been singularly consistent in the manner in which they have sought to engage India and to enhance our relationship. So, when you look at that kind of consistency, you realize that in many ways this is deeper than the politics of the day.
Mm-hmm.
That this is something which is structural, where there is actually a kind of an establishment consensus, if you would, because remember, they've alternated politically as well. So now, in the case of President Biden, because he's been around for a long time, I've been around a long time, and I can say here's someone who's been around very much longer. He's actually been involved in the growth of the relationship at different points of time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going to see him along with my boss in 2005. At that time, I think, if I remember right, he was the ranking minority member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dick Lugar was the chairman, and seeking his support for the nuclear deal. So he's known this relationship, or he's seen the evolution of this relationship, and as vice president, when Prime Minister Modi came to the US in 2014, I was the ambassador then. He was vice president, and he was strongly supportive of what we're trying to do. But there's a larger point, I think, about the Biden administration. In one way, it's an extraordinarily experienced administration. If you look at the Secretary of State, the NSA, the Director CIA, the DNI, even the Secretary of Defense. I mean, these are people who work multiple administrations, know the world. They're not new on the job. I mean, they really put it together. You're really looking at 100+ years of experience out there. Secondly, collectively, I think this is an administration which is very determined to get along with the world, which is willing to make the adjustments in many ways to find, maintain, and develop partners. So I do not mean it in any way as disrespect. It's not easy if you're the most powerful country in the world to be necessarily sensitive and necessarily adjusting. To me, the big change, and one of the reasons in my opening remark, I said that, the Quad is working well because the pillars of the Quad are all well developed and are working well. But I think one other reason the Quad is working well is actually the United States is showing the flexibility and the understanding to make the Quad work well. And this is a big evolution, to my mind, really, in America's approach to world politics.
How can we make the Quad work better? What else would you like to see the Quad do?
Right now, I don't see any big obstacles. But to my mind, in a way, the Quad's novel. I mean, it's novel in the sense that typically, the post-45 world has the post-45 world, which you know better, which we have less experience of. It's a world of treaties and alliances and sort of legalistically underpinned commitments. You actually have a grouping very easy. There's no agreement. There's no secretariat. These are practices. We make it up as we go along. So it's just a much more loose-limbed way of an open-minded way of actually working together, which, by the way, suits us when I think today suits the other three countries as well. So for me, it's not like we have a barrier and impediment. What we probably would need to do is to keep, a bit like your phone, need to keep pressing the refresh button and getting new ideas and, how do you keep growing the agenda? My sense is I've dealt with Quad this time around both as Foreign Secretary, as the Permanent Secretary before, now as the Minister. I've seen it now grow to the summit level. But the more we work together, the more we will find areas for cooperation. This is actually a kind of exploring and doing at the same time.
All right, let me come to the bilateral relationship. When I interviewed you 2 years ago, you said to me that if there is one relationship I take great satisfaction in, it's the India-Australia relationship. As you mentioned, since the change of government, there have been a whole string of Indian ministers visit Australia. You were making interesting comments earlier about how the US-India relationship is changing for structural reasons as much as personal reasons. You talked about an establishment consensus. Is that how you'd characterise the changes in the India-Australia relationship too? Or to ask the question a different way, has it changed since the change of government, change of Prime Minister, change of Foreign Minister? How much of this is personal and how much is structural?
I am increasingly getting the impression that it's structural here too. Because quite honestly, we are just as comfortable with this government as we were with the previous one. And bear in mind, because again, if I were to pick an inflection point, in the case of the US, I took Clinton and then Bush as the two inflection points. I think here it was really that Tony Abbott-Modi exchange of visits in 2014 which really set the ball rolling. And since then, we've had multiple prime ministers in Australia. But I think all of them showed a commendable level of interest in growing the relationship. And my own involvement at a political level is, pre your election and post your election. And I would say, and actually it so happened that for your current government, the first day on the job was to spend time with us in Tokyo, because we had a Quad summit. So I frankly think it's been a very, very smooth transition. I see just as much interest, same enthusiasm. Whatever was worked out in the last days of the previous government, the trade stuff, the financial stuff is moving along. I think there are a lot of new ideas on the table which will get picked up. I think particularly education offers a lot of possibilities. Possibilities not just at this end, actually to internationalize and modernize the Indian education system as well through greater global exposure. So I think I'd be fairly confident saying that this has now become structural here.
What about the relationship between the leaders? Mr. Modi and Mr. Morrison famously had a good relationship. I don't know whether Albo's such a deft hand with the curry or not, but what have you noticed in that, especially in that first Quad meeting between Mr. Albanese and Mr. Modi?
No, I thought that they got along quite visibly well, and I think some of that, my recollection of that meeting was, I think your Prime Minister, spoke about his personal visits to India. And I think there was some interesting stuff he said there which caught our attention in a good way. So I'm pretty confident that this relationship is going to go well. They've done a virtual meeting as well after that. So I think the chemistry will be good.
Let me ask you about AUKUS, which is speaking of innovations, is a huge innovation in Australian foreign policy, especially the commitment to acquire a fleet of nuclear-propelled submarines. I understand from the interviews you gave yesterday that India supported the recent IAEA assessment that the plan doesn't represent a proliferation risk. Can I ask you, is that the case? Are you comfortable with it from that point of view? But also, what do you make of AUKUS as a nuclear power yourself? How would the acquisition of this kind of capability change India's perception of Australia as a strategic actor, as a strategically capable actor?
Look, these are capability decisions and, in a sense, strategic calls are for the countries concerned to make. It's not reasonable, and frankly, it's not sometimes even fair for another country, to pass judgments on it when you don't have necessarily a full and informed picture of the whole issue. So we have been quite prudent about voicing our view on the decisions which you took, and that's understandable. My point, which I made yesterday to your press, was that the matter did come up. I think there was some press speculation on this matter. The matter did come up at the IAEA General Conference. We took the position, because I can speak for myself here. We took the position that we would respect the judgment of the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, which many of us know him. I know him personally. We have a great deal of regard for his objectivity and his professionalism. And therefore, that's it. Now, it would appear that, this sense was shared by a number of other countries, and that's really what happened out there.
All right. Dealt with that one very deftly, I thought. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and then I might come back with one more perhaps for the Minister. But let me go to the audience now and see. I see Penny Wensley, who is a Lowy Institute board member, but also a former Australian High Commissioner to India. I'll ask the questioners to wait for the microphone and then put their question to the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and Minister, thank you. I was very interested to watch your address to the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago, and you referred to reformed multilateralism, and you acknowledged that reform of the Security Council was at the core of that, but that's a really hard nut to crack. How, in fact, do you think India can advance its purposeful agenda for reformed multilateralism? And I ask you this against the background of your strong commitment to diplomacy and paying more attention to diplomacy, but also as a former ambassador to the UN and committed multilateralist. I think if India can help to lead the way on this, then it would be a very good thing in the current circumstances globally.
Well, I agree with you that it's a hard nut, but hard nuts can be cracked. If I look back and say, well, this one is too difficult, I wouldn't be doing too much in my life. I mean, life has been a set of challenges, particularly for a country like India. So I would not let the difficulties of that challenge deter me or discourage me. In fact, I'd put it the other way around. Ask yourself, put India aside for a moment. Look, there are whole continents today which actually feel that the Security Council processes do not take into account their interests. I spoke earlier about Ukraine and a sense in the global south that their problems of food and fuel and fertilizer are being just brushed aside. And frankly, if you go to a UN General Assembly and talk to countries, there are countries in Africa and Latin America and the small island states, quite apart from Asia and India, who feel very, very strongly that this is not their UN in a way. And I think that's hugely damaging to the UN. So one of the developments this time, in fact, has been a very explicit recognition by President Biden of the need to actually reform the UN, which is not a small development. But we need to because we all know why reform has been blocked for so many years. So I think it's important to keep up the pressure. There is global sentiment out there. We completely understand. This is not something which is going to be done easily and necessarily speedily. But it's something which has to be done finally. Otherwise, we will end up, frankly, with an increasingly irrelevant United Nations.